I'm Jenny from 20 by Jenny, and we're here today to talk to Katherine Paterson and her longtime editor, Virginia Buckley. You may know Katherine Paterson from her two Newbery Medal winning books, Jacob Have I Loved and Bridge to Terabithia, and her Newbery Honor book, The Great Gilly Hopkins. But today we're going to talk to her about her new book, The Day of the Pelican. So we're here today with Katherine Paterson and her editor, Virginia Buckley. And they've been working together for more than 30 years.
40,
is that right?
Almost
40.
40. Mm-hmm.
And can you talk about what it was like when the manuscript first crossed your desk? Do you remember?
Well, all right.
Can you remember?
It really didn't cross my desk, interestingly enough. I was going to work part-time, and I had two small children, so part-time was just fine for me. And actually, another editor had this manuscript about an early Japanese with a background. What was the 11th century Japanese? The sign of the 12th, sign of the chrysanthemum, on her shelf, and she was nursing a baby, so she didn't have time to get to it, which is what happened. And so she said, "Well, I'll give it to the new person who's just coming in 2 days a week." So that's how I got it, because she didn't have time to do it. Because she was going home at noon to nurse her baby, and she had this waiting. And we've been together ever since.
And that was Sign of the Chrysanthemum,
Catherine?
Which I didn't know anybody in publishing, so I had just been going around. And finally, Sandra Jordan, who was Anne Beneduce's assistant, just out of college assistant, was in the slush pile over the transom, whatever the proper language is, and she found it, and she took it to Anne, and she said, "I think we need to publish this." And Anne had just come back from Japan, so this book that most people thought was unmarketable, Anne thought was.
And Anne had just taken a position at Kroll because Elizabeth Riley had left, I believe. So Anne was new. That's why, and I have been working with Anne Beneduce. And
did the two of you meet right away, or did you work on your manuscript?
I love that story. I love that story.
You could tell that story.
Okay, we finally met with the third book, right?
Yeah.
And as you tell it, Katherine, you were wondering about how you were going to deal with this New York editor and what to do. So Katherine chose a Japanese restaurant, but she knew that she would be at home there, and I was delighted to a Japanese restaurant.
I was going to show off my Japanese, which was much better then than it is now.
Yeah. So we met over lunch in a Japanese restaurant because Katherine was a little concerned about being in New York with a New York City editor, but we had such a wonderful time. We talked about our families mostly.
Yeah. Well, I had seen a picture of the whole Kroll staff.
Oh, right.
And there's a teeny little, smaller than my fingernail, picture of Virginia, and I would study it to see if I thought she would like me when she actually met me. Now, we were working on a third book together.
Right. That was the Master Puppeteer.
The Master Puppeteer,
right.
Yeah.
So you did publish all three of the Japanese cycle in a row?
Yeah.
Yes,
in
1, 2,
sequence.
3. Right. And then did you do the Chinese book after that?
No,
or was
no.
Gilly? Gilly was the next one.
No, the next one was Bridge to Terabithia.
That was Bridge to Terabithia. Wow.
So you moved right from the Japanese cycle into Bridge to Terabithia.
Yeah.
And that was a very personal story for you, wasn't it,
Yes.
Katherine?
We were friends by this time because we'd met on the previous book, but not the kind of people that you go tell all your problems to. So I don't think you'd even been aware that I'd had cancer or had been operated on for cancer earlier that year. And then that summer, our son David's best friend, Lisa Hill, was struck and killed by lightning. And the combination of the children thinking I was going to die and then Lisa actually dying was pretty terrible. And so in
you told that story
January.
in your acceptance
January.
speech.
I we lived in Washington at the time. I went to Washington Children's Book Hill luncheon, and from Dutton, of course, Durrell from Dutton was our guest speaker, and it was my turn to sit at the table with the guest speaker, and So somebody said, you know, how are the children? And I said, you know, because the children were terrible, in terrible shape. And after I sort of shut up, Andrew said, you ought to write that story, you know. But of course the child couldn't die by lightning because no editor would ever believe that. And I went home and I thought, well, you know, what Sororian says, wait 15 years, and I've what, you know, it's been 5 months or 6 months, but maybe it would help me just to write it. And so I began.
And she said it was your death that you were afraid of, not
that was my friend Estelle. When I got to the point where in the next chapter Leslie Burke was going to die, I stopped writing because that's the only way I could keep her alive. And I happened to be having lunch with an old school friend of mine, and she said, how's the new book coming? Of course, she didn't know what new book I was working on or anything, and nobody's supposed to ask me about what I'm working on. But Estelle has no respect, so I just blurted out, you know, writing a story about a friendship between a boy and a girl. And the girl dies, and I can't let her die. And I said, I guess I can't go through Lisa's death again. And she said, I think it's yours. And I thought, well, if it's my death I have to face, then I finished the book. So I sent it off to Virginia, as I've often said, before the sweat evaporated, which no real writer would ever do. And then just for sure she was going to say, well, it's been nice working with you, but obviously.
the very secure author.
But Virginia could tell it from her point of view. But of course, I was devastated when I realized what I had done, because I knew it wasn't a good book. Yeah, I just couldn't stand having it around the house. It was too painful.
Well,
and Virginia calls me up and she said, I want to talk to you about this new manuscript. She said, I laughed through the first 2/3 and cried through the last. And I thought, oh, she knows what I'm trying to do. And she said, now let's turn it into a book.
I love finding out what I actually said.
No, that's what you said. And I thought, that's right. It's not a book yet. It's just a cry of pain. And the question and I've often told this story because I think it shows how important an editor is. She said, you know, I can, in a true, first she said, is this a book about friendship or is it a book about death? And I said, I had thought up until that moment it was a book about death. And then I realized that it was a book about friendship. And so I said, oh, it's a book about friendship. And she said, well, that's what I thought, but you have to go back and write it that way. And she said, in any true friendship, both friends change and grow. And I can see Jesse changing because he knows Leslie, but I can't see Leslie changing because she knows Jess. Oh. Do you remember all this? And then, I remember it perfectly because it was so important to my development as a writer. And she said, what's got to happen for us to see that Jess's friendship has had effect on Leslie? And that's when Janice Avery entered the book. There was no Janice Avery in the first
right. That
round.
was a whole new area that you finally got into. That was a wonderful, wonderful scene with her in the bathroom. In your Newbery acceptance speech, we were sitting on the dais there, and you got up and gave your speech. And I was sitting next to the CEO. And I looked around the room. There was not a dry eye in that room.
You know, I've been very nervous, as you would be, speaking for Newbery. And what Harper had done, because by this time Harper had taken over Kroll, had put my children right in front of me so that I was talking to my children, really. And it was such a help to me. And I thought, I think this went really well, and I felt good, and I turned around, and there was the CEO weeping, and I thought, I've embarrassed the company.